Welcome back, everybody, to another lecture here in History 1302, and today the topic that we will be covering is that of American imperialism. Now, ever since the end of the American Civil War, as we've talked about with the previous several topics, we saw that the American economy was drastically expanding. We saw the rise of American industry, the rise of robber barons, and so on and so forth. And we saw that this had a tremendous impact on American society, regardless if it was in the Northeast, the South, or whether it was out in the West. However, as the American economy was expanding, America was emerging as a premier power within the globe. America would become the economic powerhouse by the beginning of the 20th century. And as America's economy was continuing to expand, and as it was beginning to rival many of the other European nations that we see at this time, many Americans were becoming increasingly aware that they were emerging as a world power. However, by the end of the 19th century, in order for America to become a true world power, it needed to A, dominate trade, and B, acquire its own empire. And that's why America, by the beginning of World War I, will establish its own unofficial empire. Because to become a world-class nation, the U.S. had to adopt its own empire. Now, as we talk about this idea of imperialism, or building an empire, I do want to point out that it's nothing unique to Americans at this time. In order for the U.S. to become a premier world power, they have to construct an empire. This is what everybody was doing over in Europe. And so the idea of imperialism, it extends long before the 1890s, the period that we're talking about today. I mean, heck, you could even make the argument that imperialism was in place prior to the establishment of the original 13 colonies. So it was nothing new to world history. However, by the end of the 19th century, in order for you to be seen as a world-class power, i.e. as a potential superpower, you had to construct your own empire to control trade and to acquire a great amount of wealth. And as America was expanding, this is where by the 1890s, America would ultimately expand to acquire its own empire. Now, a big reason what's going to motivate Americans to support this idea of imperialism is because they want to continue to see the expansion of the American economy. And the only way to do this was to dominate much of the trade that we see throughout the Pacific as well as in the Western Hemisphere. So trade is going to help fuel this imperialistic venture for at least the United States. Now, there will be other issues, and we'll talk about them coming further down the road, but do remember, trade is going to be a key factor in all of this. Now, with that said, as mentioned before, America, by the time we get to World War I, will construct its own unofficial empire. Because in order to control much of the trade around the globe, or really specifically in the Western Hemisphere as well as out in the Pacific, America needed to gain territory. And we'll see that by the by the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, America is going to establish what they would call a new manifest destiny, to expand America not only economically but also politically around the globe, especially in those two regions I just mentioned a moment ago. Now, with this new idea of manifest destiny, Americans were looking to expand American trade abroad, to open up new markets. And alongside this, as America's economy was expanding, as I mentioned a moment ago, they were looking to spread American prestige, institutions, democracy, and they were looking to acquire their own empire. However, while we do see writers begin to put forth this image, it won't come until the Spanish-American War to when we see America will acquire its own empire, and almost by accident. Now, with that said, what leads to the outbreak of this conflict, and how is it going to lead America into a new century, one that has been dubbed by historians as the American century? Well, the Spanish-American War is going to begin over a fight that we see occur down in Cuba. Now, I'm not going to go into too great of detail, but what basically happens is by the 1890s, Spain, which used to be a powerhouse within the New World, within the Americas, its once great empire had now greatly diminished. All throughout the 1800s, all of the Latin American countries had declared independence against Spain. And Cuba was really the last holdout of the Spanish Empire within the New Worlds. However, by the 1870s and the 1880s and the 1890s, we do see that Cuba was witnessing a significant insurrectionist movement trying to either overthrow the Spanish crown within Cuba or to institute some major reforms to their system. Well, eventually, by 1896, this would lead to the outbreak of a major revolt in Cuba. And over the course of the next couple of years, we'll see that the Spanish and the Cuban insurrectionists would be fighting one another. Now, in the meantime, we have to remember the proximity of where Cuba is to the United States. It's only about 70 miles off of the Florida Keys, or the U.S. border that we see just to the north. And with that said, since this conflict was in such close proximity to the United States, it was impacting the U.S. a great deal, not only in regards to its trade, but also because of travel throughout the region. Now, with that in mind, we do start to see that within the American press, there was a significant push to support Cuba in its fight for independence. We mainly see through a group known as the Yellow Press that they were trying to invoke American emotions to support the Cuban insurrectionist cause. And this would have a pretty strong effect on the American public, because as we get to 1896, 97, and 98, the American public is going to be very much influenced that they should get involved in some capacity in the conflict that we see developing over in Cuba. So that way the Cuban people could be free as the Americans were. However, we'll see that the administration at the time, the McKinley administration primarily, is going to avoid war. Mainly because William McKinley, a former soldier during the Civil War, does not want to send a generation of young Americans off to die on the battlefield. However, Jingos, as they were called, or individuals like Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, and several others who promoted war and who wanted to go off and see the elephant, were demanding that a conflict come. However, by the end of 1897 and the beginning of 1898, it looks like that tensions for going off to war against Spain were beginning to diminish. However, by February of 1898, that would all change, because we will see an American battleship that had been sent down to Havana Harbor down in Cuba is going to blow up within Havana Harbor, and the Americans are going to blame the Spanish. That ship would be that of the USS Maine. Now, the explosion that occurs on the USS Maine, it will occur on the night of February 15th, 1898. Now, with that said, when there was an investigation that was conducted, it would be determined that at the time there was an outside explosion that caused this. And many Americans believe that there was some sort of enemy that had placed a mine outside of the ship. Well, they're going to immediately blame the Spanish. And the Yellow Press is going to capitalize on this and state that the Spanish had blown up the USS Maine to re-spark calls for going off to war against Spain. And we'll see that the McKinley administration, unfortunately, isn't going to be able to hold back these calls for much longer. Because by the time we get to April of 1898, we will see that war fever was gripping much of the nation. They were demanding to go off to war against Spain to seek out revenge. And finally, in the middle of April, the U.S. Congress will declare war against Spain. And McKinley would call for the raising eventually of over 125,000 volunteers to fight Spain. Now, with that said, just briefly, I wanted to kind of cap off my discussion about the USS Maine. As I mentioned, with the investigation that was conducted at the time, they determined that there was a mine that must have exploded the ship. However, when we've looked at evidence from recent investigations in Havana Harbor, it has determined that there was probably 2 explosions within the USS Maine. So, nonetheless, we'll see that Americans used this event at the time to justify going off to war against Spain. Now, quickly, there would be over 125,000 soldiers that would respond to the call of duty, and we'll see that there would be a substantial number of them who would look to join a new regiment that was being formed. That's going to be widely publicized by the American press during the course of this conflict. That of the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, or I should say the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, or that of the Rough Riders, which would be led by one Colonel Leonard Wood, but more notably, the second in command would be that of Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, he had not become president yet. However, his actions during the war are going to propel him to the presidency. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the beginning of this conflict, and he would resign his post so that way he could go off and fight and see the elephant. Well, eventually leading this unit, training them near San Antonio, Texas, and then eventually taking them over to Cuba by June of 1898, he would receive a great deal of fame for his actions at the Battle of San Juan Hill. Now, I'm not going to talk into too much detail about the Battle of San Juan Hill, but it will be highly publicized. But really, whenever you look at it in newspapers at the time, they're going to basically state that it was just Theodore Roosevelt and his regiment. But I do want to point out there were other regiments involved, and they're not going to get the same amount of publicity. Mainly because I can't remember the exact percentage, but there was a good chunk of those soldiers who were African American. You do see the Buffalo Soldiers fighting there, and as a result, because of their skin color, they're not going to be publicized within the American press at this time. But anyways, as we would see at the Battle of San Juan Hill, it would end in an American victory. In the Spanish-American War, it's really going to be a lopsided victory for the Americans. We'll see that the war itself will only last about 113 days, and it will come to a conclusion after the U.S. has taken a significant amount of territory. One, we'll see that by August of 1898, Guam as well as Hawaii were within the American hands. I do want to point out Hawaii was not a Spanish territory, but the U.S. would annex it. Also, they had captured, I shouldn't say captured, but they had successfully pushed the Spanish out of Cuba as well as Puerto Rico. And by this point, we also see that they had defeated the Spanish in the Philippines outside of Manila Bay. And with that in mind, the Spanish are going to realize, well, their days of running an empire are over, and they must quickly seek the peace if they're going to gain back any territory. However, in the peace deal that would be agreed upon in December of 1898, we will see that territory would not be restored back to Spain. And the peace deal that would be established is that of the Treaty of Paris, which will give the U.S. an unofficial empire. Now, through the Treaty of Paris, the U.S. would come to acquire Puerto Rico, Guam, other islands within the Caribbean, and more significantly, the Philippines, all for about $20 million that they would exchange for from the Spanish. Now, with that said, all this territory that the U.S. has just gained through it, this raises a new question. What is to become of this territory? Because we will see that the U.S. is going to employ many of these territories as basically colonies. And after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the U.S. accidentally gains a major, its own empire. Now, with that said, this is going to lead to lingering consequences, because the question is how to govern these territories. Are those peoples that lived in those territories in Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Guam, are they American citizens, or are they considered something different? Now, through the insular cases that would be processed during the early 1900s, we'll see that constitutional rights will not expand to those territories in many cases. And with that said, as we start to see the Americans begin to occupy much of this territory, especially out in the Philippines, there's going to be a lot of resistance against the U.S. arriving, especially by Emilio Algonado, who is going to be the Philippine insurrectionist that we see over in the American Philippines. And he's going to rise up against the Americans, discontent with the fact that he feels that they basically betrayed them in their own fight for independence. And when the Spanish-American War comes to an end, it would lead to the outbreak of an even longer, bloodier, and more unpopular conflict, that of the Philippine-American War. Now, one of the bitter legacies of American imperialism, as well as the Spanish-American War, is going to be that of the conflict of the Philippine-American War. As mentioned just a moment ago, we'll see that the Americans, whenever they come into these territories, they're not going to grant genuine independence for these peoples, especially out in the Philippines. Now, very similar to what we had seen develop out in Cuba, in the Philippines, the Filipino peoples in 1896 had launched their own revolt against the Spanish, hoping to overthrow them. And when the Americans arrived in the Philippines in May of 1898, the Filipino peoples are going to quickly ally themselves with the Americans because they had a common enemy. And the hope was that once they had defeated the Spanish, the Philippines would be granted their independence. Well, as we had seen through the Treaty of Paris, the Philippines would not be granted their independence. They become an American colony, and many of the rights of the native peoples who populate the Philippines, those rights that we see within the U.S. Constitution aren't going to extend to them. And this is going to lead the insurrectionist Emilio Algonado to rise up against the Americans and conduct a bloody war that would last the better portions of the next 4 years. By the spring of 1899, we'll see that relations between the Americans as well as the Filipino peoples had deteriorated into all-out conflict. Guerrilla warfare would re-ensue within the Philippines. And we'll see that there would be thousands of more deaths out in the Philippines by American soldiers than what we had seen within the Spanish-American War. Now, this war, though, is not going to be highly publicized because of the fact that we'll see much of the main fighting in the Spanish-American War had come to an end. And two, because we'll see out in the Philippines, it's not going to be one of those glamorous conflicts that we had seen like the Spanish-American War. Now, with that said, we will see out in the Philippine-American War, there's going to be a great amount of atrocities that are going to be committed by U.S. troops. Rape would be something that would be widespread throughout the region, and also we'd see that American troops would begin to round up the countryside and put Filipinos who were suspected of being guerrilla fighters or insurrectionists in concentration camps. Now, with that said, just briefly going off topic, I want to talk about the term concentration camp. We often think of the concentration camps of World War II, of Nazi Germany. Now, with that said, we'll talk about those in a future class, but really quick with concentration camps that we see employed in the Philippine-American War and also by the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, it was meant to concentrate a specific, whether it was ethnic, political, or certain group within a concentrated area. Now, these camps, living conditions are going to be horrid. They're not going to be relatively well funded or supplied, but nonetheless, these are camps that we often see employed by other powers even prior to this point. And we'll see the Americans are going to adopt this model in the Philippine-American War, and when these things do get reported back in the U.S., this conflict would become ever more unpopular. Especially as we see more American troops die and this war lasts longer and longer, we'll see that there would be a lot of pressure applied towards both the McKinley and later the Roosevelt administration to bring about an end to this conflict. And fighting won't end in the Philippines until 1902. And we'll see the U.S., though, while it emerges victorious, it will continue to have a somewhat strained relationship with some of the natives that we see within the Philippines. And the U.S. will continue to govern the Philippines until we get to after World War II, when finally it would grant the Philippines its independence. But that's a story for in the future. But anyways, we see out of the Treaty of Paris that there was a bitter legacy in the Philippines. But that won't be the only area to where we'll see that the Americans are going to leave a very bitter legacy within their empire. We'll also see that as a part of the treaty that had been signed with the Spanish, Cuba would be granted its own independence. However, its independence is going to be greatly limited by what's known as the Platt Amendment. So when Cuba is granted its independence, it will create, or the people of Cuba will create their own constitution. And under a great deal of pressure by both Americans who are occupying Cuba at this time, as well as by American politicians, we'll see that the Cuban politicians who are influenced by them are going to narrowly vote and approve the Platt Amendment, which basically states in the Cuban Constitution at this time that America can retain control of certain forts as well as territory within Cuba, and when it wants to, basically can intervene in Cuba's affairs. This is where we'll see the U.S. would acquire Guantanamo Bay, where we still see the U.S. Maintaining it up to this present date. However, the Platt Amendment is going to be very unpopular amongst the Cuban peoples, who believe that they did not get genuine independence. And this will lead to future revolutionary movements, and we'll talk about that with Fidel Castro during the 1950s, as they were very discontent with this government that was established. Meanwhile, we'll see that the people of Puerto Rico, they're also not going to be able to be independent. They're going to be governed solely by the U.S., and they're not going to be treated as equal U.S. citizens. As mentioned a moment ago, as a part of the insular cases, they would not be able to enjoy the same rights as those living over in the United States. And this would be the case all across the American empire that have been acquired. Now, the U.S. will make slow territorial acquisitions over the better course of the next couple of decades, but for the most part, the U.S. would acquire a large portion of its empire through the Spanish-American War. However, America, as we see acquired its own empire, we'll see that it will become more active on or within foreign affairs as we enter the new century. So as the Spanish-American War comes in and America acquires its own empire, it really kickstart what will become known as the American century. Following the territorial acquisitions that we see within the Spanish-American War and with America's victory over Spain, America was seen as an emerging world power. Eventually, with this conflict and moving forward, America would become more integral within foreign affairs, not only in the Western Hemisphere, but throughout the world as we enter the 20th century. And we'll see imperialism, as we get into the 20th century, is going to look drastically different because the United States isn't going to necessarily conquer a lot of territory, but they're going to greatly influence a lot of the politics that we see, especially within the Western Hemisphere. And we see this occur under the Roosevelt administration. Now, McKinley, or President McKinley, he'll begin this period of imperialism. However, he will be assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt, who after his victory at San Juan Hill had been propelled to the vice presidency in the election of 1900, he's then going to take over and he's going to continue this idea of imperialism, which will become very much ingrained within the ideas of the progressives, who we'll talk about in a future lecture. But anyways, he's going to look to continue to intervene within affairs around the world because he sees America as this major global power. And he believes that the Western Hemisphere was America's spheres of influence and that America should deter other European powers from getting involved in Latin American affairs. Now, he's going to look to use the Monroe Doctrine that had been established in the 1820s to ensure that European powers did not invade any Latin American countries and establish their own empires. But we'll also see that he's going to institute what's known as a Roosevelt Corollary, which is basically going to allow him to intervene in Latin affairs when he wants to avoid European colonization. Not to mention, as a part of his idea of imperialism, we'll also see that Theodore Roosevelt is going to be able to annex a slight portion of territory to construct the Panama Canal. And we'll even see at one point he would almost go off to war with Germany and trying to make sure that they did not acquire territory in Venezuela during this period. Meanwhile, we'll see that imperialism would only continue to kind of change as we get into future presidents, because under the president William Howard Taft, we'll see that he would begin to practice dollar diplomacy to hopefully avoid all-out conflict within some of these regions. Now, what dollar diplomacy basically is in a nutshell, if the U.S. wanted to maintain a friendly regime within Latin America, instead of using military forces to suppress any sort of rebel group that might be opposing them, we'd see that the U.S. would intervene with finances, issue out loans to these governments so financially they would remain stable. And this way, America, or the United States, could affect the affairs that we see down in Latin America. And we'll see that this policy would only continue into the 1910s, the 20s, and beyond. And if you ever wonder why there's a lot of tension between the U.S. and some of those Latin American countries up to this day, it dates back to this era of American imperialism. However, while we do see America engage in imperialism both at the end of the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century, this is not to say that all Americans supported this idea, because there was a grand movement that resisted this idea of building an empire, of expanding American trade abroad by doing so. Now, this group that's going to heavily oppose American imperialism and the idea of growing an American empire overseas is going to be that of the Anti-Imperialist League. They're going to make the argument that American democracy had no real clauses to dictate how to govern an empire. And they even believe that the practice itself was unjust. Now, they're going to largely be led by individuals like William Jennings Bryan, who would campaign off of this within the election of 1900, and they would gain significant momentum. However, the Anti-Imperialist League, we will see that they're going to fail to impact American foreign policy, at least at the beginning of the 20th century. And it won't be until the 1920s to where we start to see American administrations really be interested in being in an isolationist state, stepping away from events that we see occurring abroad, or even engaging in this idea of imperialism. And even in the election of 1900, while we will see the Anti-Imperialist League will gain significant momentum, it would not be enough for William Jennings Bryan to defeat William McKinley. And McKinley would take office once again in 1900, only continuing this era of American imperialism. However, the age of American imperialism, while we'll bring to an end our discussion of it here today, it will continue well into the 20th century. As I mentioned before, this century would become known as the American century by historians. But with that said, as we finish up our discussion with imperialism, America by this point was an emerging world power. And when we get to a future conflict, now that America was a respected nation, perhaps one of the more powerful nations in the world, when we see the outbreak of war in Europe, which is really going to have its origins within this period, we will see that the European powers are going to try to enlist, if you will, the Americans on their side. We'll talk about that when we get to World War I. But anyways, we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up our lecture over American imperialism with that note. But anyways, before we leave, just like always, just a friendly reminder, make sure that you go out, watch all videos, make sure you complete all assignments, read the chapter within the textbook, get all of that completed. But with that said, if you ever have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, I'll see everybody in the next lecture.